The Vectory fleet entered the Meridian system with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. And they found exactly what they expected to see: a small defensive force of council ships arranged in a traditional formation. Vastly outnumbered and already showing signs of the fear that had characterized every previous engagement, what they did not see were the 40 vessels hidden in the asteroid fields and sensor shadows surrounding the system, waiting with weapons charged, and crews ready for the signal that would change the war forever. Colonel Beak watched the enemy advance from her position aboard the Defiance and gave her orders with calm precision. Defensive force. Execute withdrawal pattern Gamma on my mark. The council ships began retreating exactly as the Vectory expected, pulling back toward the inner system while the enemy fleet pursued with increasing speed. They are taking the bait, reported Corvin from his station aboard the Deshan cruiser Vigilant. Their formation is spreading as they pursue. This was what the Marines had taught them to create. And Corvin felt pride in watching the alien crews execute maneuvers that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. The Vectory commander pushed deeper into the system, confident that this battle would end like all the others, with council ships scattering and fleeing while his forces claimed another victory. He never saw the trap closing around him. All units, engage. Beak commanded the hidden fleet emerge from every direction simultaneously, and the Vectory found themselves surrounded by enemies who did not behave like any council force they had ever faced. Ships struck from asteroid fields and immediately repositioned rather than holding their firing positions, making them nearly impossible to target with return fire. Attack waves came from multiple vectors at once, forcing the Vectory to divide their attention and preventing them from concentrating their superior numbers. When enemy vessels tried to group together for mutual protection, the task force concentrated overwhelming firepower on isolated targets instead. They cannot adapt, Corvin realized as he watched the battle unfold. They prepared for enemies who follow rules, and we are not following any rules they recognize. The Vectory commander attempted to restore order to his fleet, but every command he gave was based on assumptions that no longer applied when he ordered his ships into defensive formations. The task force dispersed and waited until the formations broke down before striking again. When he tried to concentrate his forces for a breakthrough, the hidden vessels appeared behind him and threatened his supply ships. When he finally attempted to retreat, he discovered that the council ships he had dismissed as fleeing cowards had actually repositioned to block his escape routes. This is impossible, the Vectory commander transmitted on an open channel. You are council species, you do not fight this way, Colonel Beak responded personally, her voice carrying across the communication frequencies for both fleets to hear. We learn from better teachers, she said. The battle continued for 6 hours, and by the end, the Vectory fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Marines boarded the enemy command vessel in an action that made the first boarding seem gentle by comparison, fighting through corridors filled with desperate defenders who knew they were facing something they did not understand. Staff Sergeant Yoonji Cho led her squad toward the bridge with the same determination that characterized every Marine operation. And when she fell to enemy fire just 2 corridors from the objective, Corporal Sayo took command without hesitation. For Cho, he called to his team, and they answered with a fury that drove them through the final defenses and onto the bridge itself. The Vectory commander stood alone among the bodies of his personal guard, and he raised his weapon not in defiance, but in something that looked almost like respect. What are you? He asked again. The same question his counterpart had asked on the first captured cruiser. We already told you, Seo replied. We are Marines. The commander lowered his weapon and spoke words that no Vectory had ever spoken to a council species. I surrender. The aftermath of the Battle of Meridian sent shock waves To both the Council and the Vectory Dominion High, Arbiter Thiessen convened a special session to address what had happened and what it meant for the future of galactic civilization. Many of you are troubled by the methods employed in this victory, she acknowledged. The violence disturbs our sensibilities and challenges our beliefs about honorable warfare. Several delegates voiced their agreement, and Corvin noticed that they were primarily representatives of species who had refused to join the task force. But I would ask you to consider something, Thiessen continued. The Vectory showed us no honor when they attacked our worlds. They showed us no mercy when they slaughtered our people. And they would have shown us no respect if they had conquered our civilization. She activated a display showing the comparative casualty figures from the war before and after human involvement. We forgot something important over the millennia of peace we enjoyed, she said. We forgot that peace is maintained by those willing to fight for it. And we nearly paid the ultimate price for that forgetfulness. Corvin submitted his final report on human military culture to the Council archives, and his conclusions were studied by military academies across the galaxy for generations afterward. Humans do not love war, he wrote. They hate it with a passion that most species cannot comprehend. But that hatred makes them determined to end conflicts quickly and decisively, accepting the cost of violence in the present to prevent greater violence in the future. They fight to stop fighting, and they will endure almost anything to protect those they care about. Colonel Beak was offered a permanent position with the Council Defense Force, and she accepted on one condition. We need an academy, she told High Arbiter Thiessen. A place where my Marines can train volunteers from any species willing to learn. Many will object to spreading human methods throughout the galaxy. Thiessen warned, war is coming whether they like it or not. Beak replied, the Vectory were just the beginning. And there will be other threats that do not care about Council traditions or ancient protocols. She looked out the viewport at the stars that contained both wonders and dangers. Beyond counting, better to face those threats with clear eyes than be destroyed by comfortable illusions, she said. The academy was established on a moon in the Meridian system, and its first class of recruits gathered in a training yard that looked remarkably similar to facilities on a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy. Sergeant Major Quan stood before them, studying the assembled aliens with the same evaluating gaze that had made so many Council officers uncomfortable. They were frightened, and he could see that in every posture and expression they were uncertain about what awaited them, and they had no idea if they were capable of becoming what the Marines would demand. Quan smiled, and some of the recruits seemed even more frightened by that than they had been by his silence. You are all terrified, he announced. You do not know if you can do this, and you are questioning every decision that brought you to this place. He paused and let his words settle over them. Good, he said. That is exactly how Marines are supposed to feel before training begins. And somewhere across the galaxy, other species who had watched humanity emerge from quarantine to save a civilization that had dismissed them as primitive began to ask themselves a question. If the humans could teach the Council to fight, what else might they be capable of teaching? The answer, Corvin believed, was everything. Because humans did not just survive their deadly world and their violent history, they learned from it. And they were ready to share those lessons with anyone willing to listen. The captured Vectory cruiser yielded intelligence that changed everything. The Council believed about their enemy. Corvin stood beside Colonel Beak in the analysis chamber as human and Council specialists worked together to translate the data recovered from the enemy ship's computers. They are not superior to us, announced Senior Analyst Asara of the Ilori delegation, her voice carrying disbelief and frustration in equal measure. Their technology is comparable to ours in most respects and actually inferior in several key areas. Then how have they been defeating us so consistently? Demanded Admiral Varth, who had survived the disaster at the Sentinel Corridor, with his pride wounded far more than his body. Colonel Beak answered before anyone else could speak, because they fight without the limitations you impose on yourselves, she said. Your military doctrine is based on honor and tradition, and theirs is based on winning by any means necessary. The chamber fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officers, and Delegates High Arbiter Thiessen rose from her seat and addressed the gathering with a gravity that Corvin had never heard from her before. The Council has voted on an emergency authorization, she announced. Colonel Beak will be given tactical command of a volunteer task force drawn from any species willing to participate. The reaction was immediate, with several delegates protesting that giving command authority to a primitive species was an insult to millennia of Council tradition. Those who do not wish to participate are free to abstain. Thiessen continued, but the footage of the boarding action has been distributed to all member worlds, and there are many who now believe the humans offer our best hope of survival. 12 species ultimately volunteered ships and crews for the task force, while the remainder chose to maintain their traditional doctrines and hoped that the Vectory would be stopped by someone else. Training began the following day, and Corvin watched as Marines worked with alien crews to teach concepts that contradicted everything they had learned about warfare. Sergeant Major Quan stood before a group of Keshan officers and explained the principle of deception in combat. Your enemy expects you to behave in certain ways, he said. When you behave differently, you create confusion, and confusion creates opportunity. But to deceive an enemy is dishonorable, protested one of the Keshans. We have always faced our foes directly and openly, and you have always lost to enemies who do not share your definition of honor, Quan replied without any judgment in his voice. The question you must ask yourselves is whether honor is worth more than the lives of your people. The Keshan had no answer for that, and Corvin noticed that several of his fellow officers were beginning to look thoughtful rather than offended. In another training area, Lieutenant Park demonstrated psychological warfare techniques to a group of Varani soldiers. Fear is a weapon, she explained. If your enemy believes you are stronger than you actually are, they will make mistakes based on that belief. We have always relied on superior numbers and firepower to achieve victory, said the Varani commander, and the Vectory have defeated your superior numbers repeatedly. Park countered, because numbers mean nothing if your enemy knows exactly how you will use them. She activated a display showing recordings of Vectory propaganda broadcasts, which depicted Council forces as weak and predictable. They use fear against you already, Park continued. It is time you learn to use it against them. Corvin became an advocate for the human methods, speaking to Council members who remained skeptical and sharing his experiences. From the boarding action, I watched a human continue fighting after receiving a wound that would have incapacitated any of us, he told a gathering of Veshan military advisors. They do not fight for glory or recognition. They fight because they refuse to accept defeat. But their methods are so violent, said one advisor. Can we truly adopt such barbaric approaches and still call ourselves civilized? The Vectory do not care about our civilization, Corvin replied. They care only about conquest, and if we do not learn to fight them on their terms, there will be no civilization left to debate the ethics of warfare. As the days passed, the volunteer task force began to transform under human guidance. Learning to think of combat as a contest of wills rather than a mathematical calculation, the Vectory continued their advance, and intelligence reports indicated they were moving toward the Meridian system, a major hub that supplied dozens of Council worlds. Traditional doctrine said the system could not be defended against the force the Vectory were assembling, and several council admirals recommended evacuation. Colonel Beak proposed something different. "We do not try to hold the system," she explained at the strategic planning session. "We let them believe they are winning." Admiral Vorath, who had reluctantly joined the task force after his humiliation at the Sentinel corridor, asked what she meant. "The Vectri expect us to fight the way we always have," Beak continued. "They expect us to form defensive positions and try to hold ground. And they have prepared their tactics accordingly." She activated a tactical display showing the Meridian system and highlighted several areas where natural features could be used to hide ships. "We give them what they expect to see," she said. "A token defensive force that will retreat when pressed. And they will pursue because that is what they always do." "And then what?" asked Corvin. Beak smiled in a way that made several alien officers visibly uncomfortable. "And then we show them what happens when humans set a trap." The task force moved into position over the following week, with ships hiding in asteroid fields and sensor shadows, while a small defensive fleet made itself visible to Vectri scouts. Corvin stood on the bridge of a Deshan cruiser that had been assigned to the ambush force, and he felt something he had not expected to feel before battle, not fear. Though that was certainly present anticipation. The Marines had taught him that the moment before combat was not something to dread, but something to embrace, because that moment represented the opportunity to change the outcome of events through action rather than hope. "All units report ready," announced Colonel Beak over the task force communication network. "Remember your training and trust your instincts." She paused and then added something that Corvin would remember for the rest of his life. "Today we teach the Vectri that some prey has teeth." And as the enemy fleet appeared on the edge of the system, Corvin realized that for the first time since the war began, he was not hoping for survival, he was planning for victory. The Battle of the Sentinel Corridor began exactly as Colonel Beak had predicted, with the Council fleet arranging itself into perfect geometric formations while the Vectri watched and calculated their attack vectors. Corvin stood on the bridge of the Marine frigate Defiance, watching the tactical display as the larger Council vessels moved into position, and he felt a cold weight in his stomach as he recognized the pattern. "They are doing exactly what the Vectri expect," he said quietly. Colonel Beak nodded without taking her eyes off the display. And around her the Marines prepared for combat with movements so practiced they seemed almost bored. "The Council flagship has signaled the beginning of engagement. Protocols," reported Lieutenant Park from her station on the display. The Council fleet began its advance in orderly lines that would have been beautiful if Corvin did not know what was coming next. The Vectri did not wait for the Council ships to reach optimal firing range, instead launching waves of smaller attack craft that struck at the fleet's flanks while the main Vectri force held position. Admiral Vorath is adjusting his formation to address the flanking attack, Park announced. He is pulling ships from the center line, which is exactly what they want him to do, Beak said. The Vectri main force surged forward into the gap that had opened in the Council formation, and within minutes the orderly fleet had become a chaotic mess of ships, struggling to regroup while enemy vessels tore through their ranks. Corvin watched in horror as the flagship Eternal Accord took multiple hits, its shields failing under concentrated fire from 3 Vectri cruisers. "The Admiral is signaling a general retreat," Park reported. "All Council vessels are breaking off engagement." The display showed the Council fleet scattering in all directions, abandoning their wounded ships and fleeing toward the nearest safe coordinates. And Corvin felt shame burning in his chest as he watched his civilization's greatest military force run from the enemy. "Colonel," said Sergeant Major Kwan, "there is a damaged Vectri cruiser near our position. Its engines are compromised, and it cannot retreat with the main force." Beak studied the tactical display for several seconds before making her decision. "How?" "Bring us alongside that cruiser," she ordered. Boarding teams prepare for combat. Corvin stared at her in disbelief because no species in the council had attempted a boarding action in over 1,000 years. You cannot be serious, he said. Boarding actions are considered obsolete, only because your enemies have always followed the same rules you do. Beak replied. The Vectri have no internal defense protocols because they never expected anyone to be crazy enough to board them. The Defiance accelerated toward the crippled cruiser while the rest of the council fleet continued its retreat. And Corvin realized that he was about to witness something that had not occurred in galactic warfare for generations. I'm coming with you, he announced. Beak looked at him with what might have been approval and said, Stay behind the Marines and do exactly what they tell you. The boarding action began with explosive breaches at 3 points along the Vectri cruiser's hull, and Marines poured through the openings with weapons firing before they had even fully entered the ship. Corvin followed the command team through the central breach and immediately found himself in an environment of chaos and violence that overwhelmed his senses. The Vectri were not helpless, and they fought back with desperation as the humans advanced through their corridors. But they had never faced an enemy inside their own ships, and their defensive positions were poorly chosen. Corporal Minjco led his fire team around the corner and directly into a group of Vectri warriors who had been preparing an ambush. Contact front, SEO shouted, and the Marines reacted with speed that Corvin's eyes could barely follow. 2 Vectri fell in the initial exchange, but SEO's rifle malfunctioned in the close quarters, and instead of retreating, he drew his sidearm and continued advancing while his team provided covering fire. A Vectri blade caught him across the arm, cutting deep enough that Corvin could see the white of bone beneath the red of human blood. But SEO did not stop. He shot the attacker with his pistol and then drew a combat knife with his wounded arm, using both weapons to clear the corridor while his blood dripped onto the alien deck plates. Corvin had seen warriors from many species fight, but he had never seen anything like this. The Marines did not fight for glory or honor, and they did not follow any protocol that made sense to Council military doctrine. They fought to survive, and to ensure that their comrades survived. And they would apparently accept any amount of damage to themselves in pursuit of that goal. Medic, someone called, and the Marine appeared beside SEO to treat his wound while the rest of the team continued advancing. You should fall back, Corvin told the wounded Corporal. ECO looked at him with eyes that showed pain but no fear and said, My team is still fighting, which means I am still fighting. The advance continued through the cruiser until the Marines reached the bridge, where the Vectri commander had gathered the last of his warriors for a final stand. What followed was brutal and brief, with the Marines using coordinated tactics that Corvin could not follow to systematically eliminate each defender, until only the commander remained. Colonel Beak stepped forward and addressed the Vectri in his own language, which she had apparently learned during the voyage from Earth. Your ship belongs to us now, she said. Surrender and your surviving crew will be treated according to the laws of war. The commander stared at her with an expression that Corvin recognized as pure shock, because the Vectri had never faced an enemy that would offer mercy after such violence. What are you? The commander asked. We are United States Marines, Beak replied, and this is how we fight. Later, as the captured cruiser was secured and the Marine medics treated both human and Vectri wounded with equal care, Corvin sent his report to High Arbiter Thiessen. The Council fleet had lost 17 ships and thousands of crew members in the Battle of the Sentinel Corridor. The Marines had lost 2 killed and 11 wounded while capturing an enemy vessel. For the first time in the entire war, Corvin understood now what Colonel Beak had meant when she said the Council did not know what war actually was. They were about to learn. The Marines had been aboard the Eternal Accord for 3 days, And already the ship's crew was talking about them in hushed voices filled with equal parts fear and fascination. Corvin, a young Veshan intelligence officer assigned as liaison to the humans, followed Sergeant Major Dongyin Quan through the corridors toward the cargo bay that had been converted into a training facility. I still do not understand why your colonel requested this demonstration, Corvin admitted. Our military leaders have studied warfare for centuries. Quan glanced at him with an expression that the translator could not interpret and said nothing until they reached the cargo bay doors. Inside, the Marines had cleared a large space and arranged obstacles from materials they had found around the ship, creating a chaotic environment that looked nothing like the orderly training facilities Corvin had seen on Council vessels. You are about to see how humans prepare for combat, Quan said. Watch carefully. A group of Council military observers had gathered on a raised platform, including Admiral Varath and several other high-ranking officers who clearly expected to be unimpressed by whatever the primitive humans had to show them. Colonel Beak stood beside the platform and addressed the observers in a calm voice that carried easily across the space. What you are about to witness is a basic infantry movement exercise, she explained. My Marines will demonstrate how we approach hostile territory with unknown enemy positions. Admiral Varath made a dismissive gesture with two of his arms and said, We have drones and sensors for such situations, Colonel. There is no need for personnel to enter dangerous areas directly. And when your drones are jammed and your sensors are compromised, Beak asked. The Admiral had no answer for that, and Corvin noticed that several of the observers shifted uncomfortably at the question. Quan raised his hand, and the exercise began with Marines flowing into the obstacle course like water finding paths through stone, each member of the team moving in coordination with the others while covering different angles of approach. Corvin watched in confusion as they advanced because nothing about their movement matched any military doctrine he had ever studied. They did not maintain formation, and they used the obstacles as cover in ways that seemed almost cowardly compared to the proud stance of Council warriors. Why do they hide? Asked one of the observers. A true soldier faces the enemy directly. A dead soldier faces nothing, Quan replied quietly. The demonstration continued with simulated enemy fire forcing the Marines to adapt their movements. And Corvin noticed that they retreated from certain positions while continuing to engage the imaginary enemy. They are fleeing, Admiral Varath announced with satisfaction. Even in practice, they cannot hold their ground. They are conducting a fighting withdrawal, Quan corrected. They are giving ground while maintaining combat effectiveness, drawing the enemy into a position of our choosing rather than theirs. The concept was so alien to Council military thinking that several observers began murmuring among themselves. And Corvin could see that they simply could not process what they were witnessing after the demonstration ended. Corvin followed Quan to the mess hall, where the Marines gathered for their midday meal. And he was surprised to see Colonel Beak sitting among the enlisted personnel rather than in a separate officers' dining area. Your colonel eats with the common soldiers, he observed. Quan looked at him with that unreadable expression again and said, There are no common soldiers in the Marine Corps, and our officers share the same conditions as everyone else because that is how we build trust. Corvin sat down across from a Marine named Park, who was cleaning her weapon while simultaneously consuming what appeared to be a highly spiced food substance that would have caused severe digestive distress to most Council species. May I ask you something? Corvin ventured. Sure, Park replied without looking up from her work. Why do your people train in hand-to-hand combat when you possess ranged weapons that can kill from great distances? Park paused and finally looked at him with eyes that seemed to evaluate his worth in a single glance. Because weapons fail, she said simply. Ammunition runs out, technology breaks down. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and death is your own body and what you can do with it. But surely in modern warfare, such situations are rare. They happen more often than you would think, Park replied. And when they do, the soldier who prepared for that moment survives, while the one who trusted only in technology does not. That evening, Colonel Beak presented her tactical assessment to the council admirals in a meeting that Corvin was permitted to attend as an observer. The human had spent 3 days reviewing every engagement record in the council database, and her conclusions were delivered with a directness that made several admirals visibly uncomfortable. Your entire military doctrine is built on the assumption that your enemy will follow the same rules you do. Beak stated, the Vectri do not follow those rules, which is why they are winning. Our traditions have maintained peace for millennia. Admiral Vorath protested. Your traditions were designed for wars between civilized species who agreed on how warfare should be conducted. Beak countered. The Vectri never agreed to those rules, and they are using your predictability against you. She activated a display showing projected Vectri movements toward a region. Call the Sentinel Corridor. I am recommending that you completely abandon your current doctrine and allow my Marines to train your forces in adaptive combat techniques. The Admiral's refusal was immediate and absolute, with Admiral Vorath declaring that the Council would never lower itself to fighting like barbarians. Beak accepted this decision without argument and made a different request. Then, give me 1 frigate and permission to operate independently, she said. We will stay out of your way, but when your traditional tactics fail again, you will have an alternative to consider. The debate lasted several hours, but eventually the admirals agreed to her terms, simply to remove the uncomfortable human from their strategic discussions. As Corvin escorted the colonel back to the Marine quarters, he asked why she had not argued more forcefully for her recommendations. Beak stopped walking and turned to face him with an expression that contained neither anger nor frustration, only a calm certainty that made him deeply uneasy. Because they will not learn from words, she said. They will learn from watching their people die while my Marines survive. And then they will be ready to listen. Corvin wanted to believe that she was wrong, that the combined might of 47 spacefaring civilizations would prove sufficient against the Vectri threat, but somewhere deep inside, he already knew that the human was right, and the real lessons were yet to come. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had never been so quiet, and High Arbiter Thiessen could feel the fear radiating from every delegate in the room as the holographic display showed yet another defeat against the Vectri Dominion. 47 species sat in this chamber, representing civilizations that had conquered faster than light travel and built empires spanning thousands of star systems. Yet none of them could find words to address the disaster unfolding on the screen before them. The Vectri had destroyed another fleet, and this time it was not even close to a fair fight. 17 capital ships, announced Admiral Vorath of the Keshan Federation, his forearms trembling as he read the casualty report. 4,000 crew members lost, and the Sentinel Corridor is now completely undefended. Thiessen watched as the delegates began arguing among themselves, each species blaming another for the failure. And she knew that this pattern had repeated itself for nearly 2 cycles, now without any change in outcome. The Vectri fought differently than any enemy the Council had faced before, and the ancient military doctrines that had maintained peace for millennia were proving worthless against them. We followed all established protocols, insisted General Mekthos of the Vorani Imperium, his scaled face showing genuine confusion. Our formations were perfect, our calculations precise, and yet they broke through our lines as if our ships were made of paper. Because your protocols are predictable, Thiessen said. rising from her seat and commanding the attention of the chamber. Every species in this room fights the same way because we all learn from the same ancient texts. And the Vectri have studied those texts as well. The chamber fell silent again as delegates considered her words. And many of them shifted uncomfortably because they knew she was speaking truth that none of them wanted to hear. "What would you have us do?" asked Ambassador Krellis of the Deshan Collective, a species known for their diplomatic skills rather than military might. Abandoned 10,000 years of honorable warfare traditions. Thesan activated a secondary display showing a small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy, a world that had been under observation quarantine for 50 cycles due to the concerning nature of its dominant species. "I would have us contact the humans," she said. The reaction was immediate and hostile, with several delegates rising to their feet in protest and others making sounds of disgust that their translator devices struggled to interpret. "The Deathworlders," spat Admiral Vorath. "You cannot be serious, High Arbiter. They are violent and unpredictable," added General Mekthos. "Our observation reports show they have fought wars among themselves continuously throughout their entire history, killing millions of their own kind over disputes we can barely comprehend." Thesan nodded, because everything they said was true. And that was precisely why she believed the humans might be their only hope. "The Vectri are violent and unpredictable as well," she reminded them. "And we are losing because we do not understand how to fight such an enemy." She brought up footage from the human observation files, showing images of their military forces training in harsh environments that would kill members of most council species within hours. These creatures have evolved on a world of extreme gravity, toxic atmosphere variations, and predators that would classify as planetary hazards on any civilized world, she explained. "They have survived by being more adaptable and more resilient than anything that tried to kill them. And you believe they would help us?" asked Ambassador Krellis, his tone skeptical but curious. "We have kept them quarantined and ignored for decades. I believe we have no choice but to ask." Thesan replied. The debate continued for several more hours. But eventually, desperation won over tradition, and the Council authorized a diplomatic mission to Earth with instructions to request military advisors. 3 weeks later, Thesan stood in the docking bay of the Council flagship Eternal Accord and watched as the human shuttle approached. And she tried to prepare herself for whatever emerged from that vessel. The shuttle doors opened and a group of humans walked out in perfect formation, wearing uniforms that combined practical functionality with symbols and decorations that Thesan did not understand. At their head was a female human of average height with sharp eyes and a confident posture that immediately marked her as the leader. And she stopped precisely 3 meters from Thesan before speaking. "Colonel Unabek, United States Marine Corps," the human announced. "I was told we were attending diplomatic discussions." Thesan blinked at the directness of the statement and realized that the diplomatic briefing provided to the humans had apparently been somewhat misleading about the nature of this mission. "Welcome aboard the Eternal Accord, Colonel Beak," Thesan said carefully. "I am High Arbiter Thesan, and I must confess that our situation is more urgent than perhaps our initial communication suggested." Colonel Beak studied her for a moment, and Thesan felt the weight of that evaluation in a way she had never experienced from another species before. "How urgent?" the human asked. Thesan gestured for the colonel to follow her toward the command center, and as they walked, she explained the full scope of the crisis facing the Council. "We are losing a war," she admitted. "Our fleets cannot match the Vectri in combat, and within 6 months they will reach our core systems." "And you want us to do what exactly?" Colonel Beak asked. "Provide tactical advice while your admirals make the real decisions." That was the Council's intention. "Yes," Thesan confirmed. The human made a sound that the translator interpreted as mild amusement. And Thiessen noticed that the other Marines exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes without any words being spoken. They reached the command center where several council admirals waited, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile as they observed the small group of humans. "These are the legendary warriors from the quarantine world," Admiral Vorath said with clear disappointment. "They are so small," Colonel Beak ignored the comment and walked directly to the tactical display showing the current state of the war. And her Marines spread out behind her with movements so coordinated that Thiessen wondered if they were somehow communicating through means the Council could not detect. "Show me your engagement records," the Colonel ordered. Admiral Vorath bristled at the commanding tone but activated the display, and footage began playing of Council fleets engaging Vectory forces in multiple systems. Thiessen watched the human's face as she absorbed the information, and she saw something there that she had not expected to see. "Recognition." "Stop," Colonel Beak said suddenly. "Go back 30 seconds. The footage reversed to show a Council formation breaking apart under Vectory assault, and the human pointed at specific moments in the battle. "Here," she said. "Your ships announced their attack vector with a formation change, and the Vectory responded before you even fired. We were following standard engagement protocols." Admiral Vorath protested. "Your protocols are getting your people killed." The human replied without any emotion in her voice. "Your enemies know exactly what you are going to do before you do it because you fight like you are following a script." The admirals began objecting loudly, but Colonel Beak simply turned to her senior staff and spoke quietly in a tone that Thiessen could barely hear. "These people have no idea what war actually is," she said, and in that moment, Thiessen realized that she had been right to bring the humans here, because they were going to need every bit of the violence and unpredictability that the Council had feared for so long.